Hi there, I'm Gary Parks. I am going to be talking a little bit today about the architectural design and decoration of classic movie theaters. When we say classic movie theaters, we're going to be covering the era from the end of the Nickelodeon time, little tiny movie theaters that cost a nickel to get in back in the '05s, 1910s, 1915s, and moving up through the classic movie palace era and then ending in the post-World War II era. Okay, so I've been interested in vintage movie theaters since about 1981 when it became a nearly all-consuming passion. Um, Thought I was the only one who liked them like that. Happily, I was very, very, very wrong. But a lot of people over the years asked me how I got interested in this somewhat unusual subject. And the fact is that I'm a little bit from a show business family. My father was an animator for Walt Disney Productions and later Hanna-Barbera. My oldest cousin has worked for Warner Brothers, Disney, and other people on the technical end down in LA. And my Aunt Dorothea Lord was an actress working with Alfred Hitchcock and some other people like that. So mostly on TV. But I was lucky, and I consider myself very fortunate, that I had older parents than most of my peers. My dad was born in 1915, my mother in 1922. My dad remembered silent movies at movie palaces. And right now on your screen is the most luxurious movie palace of his hometown, Waterbury, Connecticut. He gave me stories when I was a little kid that made my eyes pop out, in that there was a pipe organ in this theater. There was a full orchestra which accompanied the silent movies, and there was vaudeville on the stage, basically live variety shows, which could be comedians, dancing puppies who then build a house on stage, I kid you not, singers, jugglers, acrobats, opera singers, you name it. It was the ancestor of today's variety show, was vaudeville on the stage of the movie palaces. So this is that theater in Waterbury, Connecticut, built in 1922. Dad started going there in 1925, so he saw it in its prime. Till I was 10, I lived in Southern California, Seal Beach, right next to Long Beach. And you're seeing a picture of me at age 10 standing in front of this abandoned, derelict old theater in downtown Long Beach, the Tracy, which was located near the Pike Amusement Park. And I loved it because it looked haunted. I loved the Haunted Mansion, Disneyland, anything that looked haunted intrigued me. But it made me feel sad because theaters of this same style were still operating. In fact, we went to some. Like this one, just a couple of miles away from the Tracy. This is the Belmont in the Belmont Shores neighborhood of Long Beach. And at the time, it was very much going. That neon just went crazy. And I used to love to watch it animate and wonder what made it work. And we saw various things there, Ten Commandments, Fiddler on the Roof, that kind of thing. But here's a theater that I could walk to. This is the Bay Theater in Seal Beach, a picture that I took in 1982 of it. It's undergoing restoration right now to be a concert venue as well as a film venue. Built in the late 40s, kind of on a budget. We'll see more theaters like that a little later. But I went here many, many times with my friends. And then the second half of my childhood, which took place around Santa Cruz. And this is Santa Cruz's movie palace, a 1936 jewel, after its neon was repaired after many years of being dormant. Del Mar, downtown, still a functioning movie theater. And another theater that was running blockbusters, as you can see, this picture dates from when E.T. first came out. The Rio, built after World War II. It's now a popular concert venue and does quite well as such. But let's step back a little bit. Now, if any of you are familiar with the Niles S&A Film Museum, housed in an old Nickelodeon, the Edison, that's a classic example of a small town Nickelodeon. Kind of simple, a little bit of decoration, not much. But in the big cities, the Nickelodeons like 1910 and up to 1920 were pretty fancy. And that's because the original movie theaters had been converted storefronts and they were seedy with gum and chewing tobacco on the floor and folding chairs and a bed sheet up on the wall. And highbrow people just went, oh, movies? Who wants to go there? We go to the opera. Well, the movie theaters wanted everybody to come, not just the folks who were getting out of the coal mines or nailing houses together. So they started decorating them up special. And so this is an example of one here. This is in Chicago. Here's one in Milwaukee. It was called the Butterfly. Now, this was when Art Nouveau architecture was popular, and you had all these wild goddesses dancing around with butterfly wings and angels and things like that. And companies provided these ornaments in catalogs, and they would put them up on the theaters. So the Butterfly in Milwaukee, this is a model, an architect's model made out of clay. Now, you look at these nickelodeons, and a lot of them had light bulbs all over the front, and those statues that you saw, and you wonder, are any of them still there? The answer is yes. Of course, the one in Niles. What about the ones that had all the little cherubs and angels and lions' heads? This one is in Gunnison, Colorado. My dad took this for me way back years ago when I was in high school. Here is a good example of where the Nickelodeon front stayed there. But it continued on as a movie theater, and maybe around the 40s, they thought it needed a little updating, and they put a little neon sign on it. And as you can see, in the 80s, it was running Staying Alive with John Travolta, the supposed Saturday Night Fever sequel. But a lot of the early movie theaters, when the crowds were getting more capacious and needing more room and more seating, oftentimes regular stage theaters built in the late 19th or early 20th centuries would be pressed into service as movie theaters later on. A lot of times this conversion took place during the Depression. This is the Montana in Butte, Montana, photographed in the early 80s when I was first photographing movie theaters. And I understand that about a year after I took this picture, it came down. So you have an early 20th century facade, kind of refined and staid and serious looking, but with neon signs and a marquee put on later when it was a full-time movie theater. Now, soon enough, some very key changes happened. Exhibitors, show people decided that there was a lot more money to be made in movies, not only in the making of them, but exhibiting them. Some people maintain this is the birth of the movie palace right here. This is the Al Ringling Theater in Baraboo, Wisconsin. That's the same Al Ringling as in Ringling Brothers Barnum and Bailey Circus. They built this theater. It's been undergoing restoration over the years. Here we have basically a Nickelodeon front, but writ large, little more permanent materials, glazed terracotta, but a marquee added onto it in the 1940s with neon. Back when the Nickelodeons were around, neon was at the experimental stage. Now, Nickelodeons typically had just a very tiny, narrow lobby, but the Al Ringling, they were aspiring to class status. We're going to be better than the Nickelodeons and give the people something more refined so that our Victorian era grandmothers will be happy to go to the movie theaters, as well as the kids who want to, throw things and goof off. This is a little lobby that the Al Ringling had, and the little sculptures on the walls are copied from Italian originals, keeping very serious and bringing art history into it. Here's the auditorium. It had a stage, so that painting that you see there is an asbestos fire safety curtain. And sometimes it would be used as a backdrop if somebody like a comedian was going to be up on stage. Notice there is an organ console off to the left. Organ consoles could raise and lower on a hydraulic lift so that when it was time to accompany the movie, they were out of sight. And then when the organist was going to do some kind of a solo, up it would rise. The organ pipes were hidden away from public view, typically. And in order to look more and more like an opera house and less of a Nickelodeon, they even had box seating. This theater is unusual in that it has an oval-shaped auditorium. We're going to be looking in depth at a couple more theaters across the country because rather than going from theater to theater, so you get a little bit of a feeling of the evolution of the decorative styles. And a little view of the ceiling dome. This was taken before restoration. This theater had very few changes done to it, considering the fact that it was built in the mid-teens. Now, it's one step from an elaborate Nickelodeon to a movie palace. And this is 1921, the Chicago, in downtown Chicago. And this is where very quickly, starting in the late teens and moving in, you had the movie palace era in full blossom. But we have some Nickelodeon attributes here. Still, the overall design of this facade is basically a gigantic Nickelodeon front, and right down to light bulbs ornamenting and outlining some of the features on the facade. The vertical sign that you see there is a 1990s replica of the original. The original lasted that long. Eventually it just got too rusty. They had to replace it. The marquee is from the 1940s, but it replaces an earlier marquee that was just about as elaborate. And then you go inside. How about a stained glass window with allegorical things in it? That green ribbon along the bottom of the coat of arms there is supposed to be a roll of film. Above that is the Balaban and Katz vaudeville and movie chains logo, looking like some sort of great family crest. And then those stained glass circles all the way around the perimeter of the stained glass window, those are film reels. So here we have high art trying to fully legitimize the motion picture as high art in and of itself. And of course, we move into grand lobbies, these huge columns. It's several stories high. It's gorgeous, and it says, the little Nickelodeons, they are passé, except maybe in the smallest towns, and downtown come in for culture. And of course, you were getting movies on the program, as well as live entertainment, choruses, chorus girls, all kinds of things, comedians and so forth, and lots of music. This is the proscenium arch over the stage of the Chicago Theater. Look at, there's some light glowing out from behind the cornices. Ornamental lighting was almost as popular as the plasterwork and painting itself. Now we're looking a little bit off to the center of the stage at one of the organ chambers. The organ pipes were hid behind wonderfully elaborate, like they looked like little altarpieces from cathedrals. And a quick look at the sidewall, more murals, more chandeliers, more elaborateness. Now, a lot of architecture critics at the time kind of poo-pooed the movie palaces. Meanwhile, the movie theater architects and their promoters were laughing all the way to the bank. Now, some theaters during this time were not super ornate. They were opulent, but quietly so. This is Proctors in Schenectady, New York. That's an original 1920s marquee, except for the reader boards, but we won't get too technical. But a little more of a refined interior. Those of you who are aware of theaters in San Francisco, the architect of this theater was Thomas Lamb. He was very prolific on the East Coast and Midwest. On the West Coast, his one theater, arguably his best and largest, was the Fox Theater in San Francisco. So this is the interior of Proctors. And looking up at the dome of Proctors, it's refined, it's dignified, but not over the top. This is the early working into the mid-1920s. By the mid-1920s and into the late 1920s, things got a little more elaborate. Architects and the promoters themselves locally, and that also means the movie chains themselves. They were financing these theaters in many cases. Look at the marquee. Above the word Stanley, which originally was its own chain, you have a WB. That's Warner Brothers. They ran Warner Brothers product originally. And here we have a Spanish-style theater, pretty ornate. And that is a 1920s marquee right now. There are stained glass panels in the sides. Then you walk in, and then to make sure that the nasty weather is kept out and that you can't hear any traffic outside, because of course everybody was buying cars if you could afford it, you have these little entrance vestibules, like a little mini lobby, and there'd be two sets of doors. And then once you'd walk into the grand lobby, you were in Movie Palace land, and all your cares and worries were supposed to disappear. And in many cases, they did. Radio was in its infancy. There was no TV. If you stayed home at night, you sat around and talked, knitted, played dominoes, played parcheesi, read a book, or you went to the movies. One thing, if you take anything away from this, back in these days, 90% of all Americans went out to the movies at least once a week. The money added up. That's how these movies could be made and these palaces could be built. They made lots of money. So here's the grand lobby of the Stanley. And notice that the lighting is getting a little more dim as you move into the building. That's because you're on your way to Fantasyland here. Now, here, it's a little dark, okay? I took this picture and I include it here to show how these theaters looked when the movie was running. You'd get a little more light from the screen, or if the vaudeville was going, there would be more light than this. But When the lights went down, it was mystery. And a lot of times when these big movie palaces get turned into performing arts centers, and thank goodness they do, because it's ensured many of their survival. But they usually key the lighting up pretty high because for live entertainment, people want to read their programs, see, the life story of the star or whatever, and so forth. But in the old days, that was okay. The show just kept going all day long and into the night and would repeat. So the lights didn't have to be as bright. Now, with the benefit of flash photography, here's a detail inside the auditorium of the Stanley in Utica, New York. Notice that it says exit number 18. Those were stained glass signs. That was so that the theater could be emptied really, really quickly. There had been, in the early 20th century, several disastrous fires in theaters where the exits were not adequately engineered, and hundreds of people, in one case, died, and a few in others. So they wanted to make sure that never happened again. So there were all these exits, and they would have numbers, so the ushers and management would know which exit was which, and also to impress the public. Ladies and gentlemen, we have 25 exits for your safety. Seriously, they promoted it like that. Now, as the 20s moved on and people got used to all these movies taking place, The Thief of Baghdad, The Black Pirate, all these things with exotic locales and everything, even if it was just on the back lot of the movie company, the designers and the movie companies realized that the public was getting a little restless. They needed to see something a little different. So because you had those movies taking place in the Middle East or China or Europe, and a lot of people still couldn't afford to go there, let's bring it to them and let's build theaters, in this case, Middle Eastern style. You've got a minaret. Some of these things, that could be in downtown Cairo today. Notice the marquee is a later addition, probably put on in the 40s. They were always restyling marquees as time went by. The box offices themselves were sometimes little microcosms of the theater itself, carrying the style over in miniature. That's original, by the way, original tile work. Look down at the bottom of the picture and see where the black glaze has worn away from decades of people buying tickets. And as the 20s came on, of course, Egyptian style got very popular because in 1922, the tomb of Tutankhamun was found, and that caused a sensation worldwide. And a lot of Egyptian style theaters were designed and built. However, this is a detail of the courtyard of Grauman's Egyptian in Hollywood, which has just been converted to an outlet for Netflix shows, as well as continuing on in its role for the American Cinematheque. Interesting thing is, people will often say, well, this theater was influenced by King Tut's tomb. It was not. It was already well underway to being completed at the time of that discovery. Just a coincidence. But not when you consider that the 1920s was all about the exotic. And in California, I think it's very appropriate that we'd have some Mesoamerican designs. This is the Mayan in downtown Los Angeles. It's now a nightclub, but at the time it was running adult film product. Beautiful designs on the facade and inside, very authentic. They put a little Aztec in there too. A lot of times these decorators and architects would throw styles together. And of course, probably the most famous exotic style movie palace ever, and maybe one of the greatest in the world and most well known, along with Radio City Music Hall in New York. You've got Grauman's Chinese Theater on Hollywood Boulevard, now running IMAX films, but it survives. Business is business. I'd be neglecting something important if I didn't show at least one picture of what they call an atmospheric theater. Now you may be saying, well, all these theaters, they were so exotic, of course they had atmosphere. Well, we're going to go a little more literal here. It's not sure who actually hit upon the idea, but some theaters, even in the teens, were starting to have little imitation night skies on the ceiling, peeping through false windows and things like that. But this one architect, John Eberson, perfected the idea. This is not one of his theaters, though. This is the Sheboygan Theater in Sheboygan, Wisconsin, one of the lesser-known theaters in this style. There were a few in the Bay Area, if you're interested in knowing that. A few of them do survive. But the ceiling, as the lights would go down before the show, the lights would dim. There would actually be twilight lighting effects over the proscenium, so it would look like a sunset followed by twilight. And then to top it off, tiny light bulb stars in the plaster of the ceiling. And they were on these little devices where they would appear to twinkle. Now, by the late 1920s, once again, it felt that the public needed a different style to look at, and the more exotic movie palaces carried their way even into the early 30s a little bit. But along came what was then considered just simply modern architecture. We call it Art Deco now, but largely came out of Europe and then took hold in America eventually in the late 20s. And this is the lobby of the Warner Theater in Milwaukee, now being restored. I took this, though, before the restoration. That is aluminum leaf. You've heard of gold leaf going on to architecture. Well, this is aluminum. So for a nice silver kind of pre-Buck Rogers kind of look. Interesting, though, the auditorium in this theater is entirely French Baroque, but Art Deco was making its way into things. Another Warner's theater, the Warner Brothers, really, I'd say more than any other chain of movie palace builders and movie production companies, did more of the spectacular Art Deco theaters than anyone else. All the major chains did do it. Think of the Paramount Theater in Oakland, for instance. But this one in a smaller city, Torrington, Connecticut, was recently restored, and I got to see it before it was restored and after. This is after. Kind of a plain front, but still with lots of lights on the front and everything. And you go in, and the lobby is very opulent, but you're starting to see, look at that railing in the foreground, starting to look a little bit like pre-space age, a little more modernistic. That was starting to get into the style at that point. And a lot of times the decorators would get a feel for the local history, or at least the general atmosphere of the town's culture. And regardless of the style of the theater, they would throw that into the style of the building and the decorative scheme, usually in the form of murals. So here we have the Warner in Torrington with kind of a colonial kind of look going on here. We got the water wheel and the guys fishing and everything. We got the Native American in the corner and the oxen moving along. But it's in an Art Deco theater. But that's okay. Here's the auditorium. I don't recall if this theater had an organ, but it was given organ chambers. You can see that ornamental grill off to the right of the stage. That's one of them. They wanted to be sure, just in case silent movies still kept on being a thing, because we're around the advent of sound pictures here, very late 20s, early 30s. Also, studios were experimenting with having widescreen movies, even in the early 30s. It didn't really take off permanently until the early 50s. But you can see that proscenium, when it was ready. When widescreen movies came in the 50s, no problem, just install the screen. You don't have to get out the jackhammer and widen the proscenium arch. It was there and ready. So there was a little bit of forward thinking in that department. Looking up at the screen, this is just because, at the ceiling, not the screen. Style was getting a little less ornate with the Art Deco. Nice thing about it for the builders, good return on their investment. It wasn't as expensive. Now, all people who love old theaters have certain little features that they geek out on. And one of mine happens to be cast iron end standards that went on the ends of the rows of seats. This one's very unusual. I do collect these. No, I did not take one from this theater. I do not do that. But when theaters have been torn down or they're being gutted for condos, as happens way too often in San Francisco, I have availed myself. So I have a few of those and have a few complete seats as well. You can't see it here, but I happen to be sitting in a San Francisco Fox chair right now. Maybe in our Q&A session, I'll show it to you, but that's later. This is the Pantages on Hollywood Boulevard. Fun little fact here. When this was built in 1930, there was a young construction manager on the job, Bill. We'll call him Bill. And he'd started out as a cartoonist. Cartoon movies were in their infancy, and he said, "Oh, I'm going to do this." Didn't quite work out for him, so he's like, "Okay, got to get a regular day job." Went into construction management. This was the first big project he was on, was overseeing the construction of the Pantages Theater. And while he was on the job, he fell off a scaffolding and nastily broke his leg. While recuperating in the hospital, he thought to himself, maybe I'll give that cartooning thing another try. Just one more. His name was Bill Hanna, and with Joe Barbera, he founded Hanna-Barbera. Those guys were my dad's bosses from 1960 to 1978. So the Pantages lost a construction manager, but the world got Fred Flintstone and Scooby-Doo. Now, the Pantages is very ornate Art Deco. This is just the ceiling of the ticket lobby, open to the street. They restored it a few years ago. It had been hidden away by the modern ceiling. Not going to show you too much Pantages. You got to see it for yourself one of these days. It does Broadway shows now. It hosted the Academy Awards for a while in the 1950s. This is just one of many ceilings that's in there in the various lobby spaces. There are dozens of different styles of light fixtures. It's wild in there. It is over the top ornate. Now, by the mid-30s and after the opening of Radio City Music Hall in 1932, which was the largest movie palace ever built, essentially 6,000 seats, the Art Deco style in that Pantages, Warner opulence started fading out. The Depression had started. By 1932 and 1933, the amount of movie palaces being built drastically dropped. People still went to the movies, but not as much. It was like, oh boy, what have we got going here? However, the Art Deco style did survive with some of the smaller theaters built in towns that didn't have a deluxe theater yet. This is the Cascade in Reading. Architecturally, it is virtually identical to one of my childhood theaters we saw earlier, the Del Mar in Santa Cruz, with the exception that the sign, the marquee, and little things like those little statues up along the top, the relief sculptures showing guys building things, those things are different over in Santa Cruz, little different style. But it's considered the sister theater of the Del Mar. Beautiful theater and wonderfully restored. Here's the lobby. Now again, more Depression era economy. We're not seeing gigantic palatial lobbies anymore. We're seeing practical lobbies that are put underneath the balcony structure to save room and money. And maybe because they can't afford as much land for the theater. All this is a bunch of decoration hiding the big angled girders that hold up the balcony. And in between those, the undersides of the concrete risers that hold the balcony seats. Who'd have thought? Hey, when you've just bought your ticket and you're going in, you're not thinking about that. You're enjoying your path to movie land. This is a detail in the Cascade lobby. This little mural here was buried under many layers of paint, and you scrape and scrape and scrape, and you find this. I've done this in several theaters myself, both professionally and as a volunteer. It's fun. It's vertical archaeology, and to see these designs show up again after being hidden so long is very gratifying. This is the auditorium ceiling, that chandelier, just to give you an idea of scale. It's been a few years since I've been there, but I guess it's about 8 feet across or so. That's etched glass, in this case with some green paint airbrushed on there. Now, we're kind of coming into the home stretch here. As the 30s wore on, this is still early 30s though, things got a little more streamlined, a little more modernistic, less ornate with the statuary and the murals and so on. Murals continued on, but they became kind of the focal point of the decoration. This is a photo of an original architectural rendering from the offices of Timothy Fluger. He was the main architect who did the Oakland Paramount. He only did 8 theaters from scratch and remodeled a few others, but the 8 he did, 7 of them still survive, and they're all masterpieces, really. This one, people aren't as aware of it. It's on Ocean Avenue in San Francisco, and yes, it does have an enormous tower like that. Not quite as tall in proportion to the building, but almost. And it said El Rey on it in neon, and then that tower was indirectly lit with floodlighting. And so that was Timothy Fluger at work. All his theaters were basically one of a kind. Here's the last one he ever designed. This is in Alameda, one of my most frequented theaters from where I live. And they were wrapping up restoration here. It had been used for other things over the years, but was highly restorable. That's an original 1932 vertical sign. The marquee is a restoration. You can see some construction off on the left. That's a multiplex that you enter through the grand lobby of the original Alameda, and the auditorium itself is still preserved. Mainly used for movies, but occasionally for live events. And then in Berkeley in 1932, you had the United Artists Theater. It was part of a building program that UA did in Southern California, and they were going to continue it in Northern California. This is the only one that got built. It had to do with theater chains vying for product and competition and stuff. And burying the hatchet and so forth and working out deals, and they decided they really didn't need to build that many more theaters. San Jose would have had one, several in LA, Pasadena, Inglewood, and so forth. Berkeley got the largest in this series of building, and all of them said on the facade, artistry and unity, or unity and artistry with allegorical figures. And they all had those same sculptures on the front. Unfortunately, you're seeing a lot of modern signage here. That gray stripe up the middle used to hold a magnificent vertical sign in light bulbs and neon. The marquee was huge and beautiful, but around the time of BART construction, when Shattuck Avenue got dug up, the illuminated sign haters of the 1970s said it's gotta go. So it just has a flat plastic sign today. Maybe someday it'll be restored. People like that stuff now, fortunately. And then as theaters got more modern, they got less expensive to build. By the late 30s, they became a lot more streamlined. Here, there's no decoration really except for the paint, the murals. Still being done by top artists. In this case, Heinz Bergen out of Los Angeles, which was in business for many, many decades. This is the Cerrito in El Cerrito. Operates for movies as well as some live shows, as you can see here. The inside had been turned into a storeroom for a used furniture store, but all this stuff was left there like a time capsule. The front of it was not so lucky. When it got turned back into a theater, they had to rebuild this sign tower and marquee from scratch, from photos and architects' drawings. Also, it was not bright blue like this originally. It was some other colors, but they thought this would be good and eye-catching, and I agree. Then we move into the 40s. This is 1941, the Orinda Theater in Orinda. I took this picture in the early 80s when it was actually thought that it was going to be torn down. But fortunately, the development that went up on the site wrapped around the theater, and they added a couple of additional theater auditoriums into a former Wells Fargo bank that was also Art Deco. And interesting thing is to point out on here, notice that tower on the left that has the cutout patterns in it. At night, neon inside glows out, and up on the little kind of wedding cake structure above it, and as well as the sign, of course, having neon that is also lit and animating. This is one of the few buildings that was directly influenced by the architecture of the Golden Gate International Exposition that was held on Treasure Island in 1939 and 1940. That exposition was originally planned to set a new architectural trend for the entire Pacific Rim. And it didn't happen because a certain war got in the way. And after that, after World War II, was like, let's make everything new. Theaters after that were a lot plainer. They still had murals. They still had interesting light fixtures. They still had showmanship, but it pretty much went more toward what we now call mid-century modern. And speaking of mid-century modern, we're going to conclude with the Ringling Theater in Moraga, built in the mid-50s. The interesting thing was, the architects who designed it, Alexander and Mackenzie Canton, the father, Alexander, had started designing movie theaters back in the 20s, and he continued doing theaters into the 50s. This theater has murals of zodiac patterns inside that once glowed in the dark, animated neon. The terracotta on the front was done by Gladding McBean Terracotta, who had been doing terracotta for theaters and hotels since back in the teens. Front of the Oakland Paramount, that's their work. Fox Oakland, same thing. One's in LA. They still were in business. They got involved in this. It has etched glass. It has a terrazzo sidewalk. You know, it has all the elements of showmanship architecturally still. After the days of this theater, theaters began to be built more in shopping centers. This one was. There's a Safeway right nearby and has been from the get-go. And after this, you had more the shopping center theater trend, and then that went into the multiplex era. And of course, by that time, anything that you would call a movie palace was, as a trend, over and done with. And so that golden age, in all its incarnations, was effectively over. But enough of them survived that we can enjoy them today. And so with that, thank you very much for watching and for listening, and much appreciated.